For the vast majority of human existence, sound was a profoundly ephemeral phenomenon. Once a noise was made, whether it was the roar of a wild animal, a clap of thunder, or the spoken word of a human being, it vanished instantly into the atmosphere. It lived exclusively in the immediate moment and then survived only in the fragile, fading memory of anyone who happened to be within earshot. This reality was a fundamental aspect of life on Earth for millions of years. Ancient civilizations developed complex systems of writing to preserve spoken language and abstract thoughts across centuries, but they had absolutely zero ways to preserve the actual physical sound of a voice. In the region of Palestine, modern-day Israel, ancient scholars and scribes meticulously copied texts and religious laws on scrolls, ensuring the words survived for 1,000s of years. Yet the specific tones, accents, and cadences of those ancient voices were lost the second they were uttered in the first millennium BC. Humanity had figured out how to capture light and shadow through painting and eventually early photography in the 19th century AD. But capturing the invisible, vibrating waves of sound remained an entirely elusive dream for scientists and inventors across the globe. To understand how humans eventually learned to capture sound, it is essential to understand what sound actually is. Sound is not a physical object, but rather a mechanical wave that travels through a medium, which is most commonly the air around us. When a person speaks, their vocal cords vibrate, which in turn causes the air molecules in their throat and mouth to vibrate. These vibrating molecules bump into the molecules next to them, creating a chain reaction of microscopic collisions that travel outward in all directions at roughly 343 meters per 1 second. When these cascading pressure waves reach a human ear, they cause the eardrum to vibrate in exact sympathy with the original source. The human brain then translates these physical vibrations into the perception of sound. For centuries, brilliant thinkers understood this underlying physics. As early as the 6th century BC, the Greek philosopher Pythagoras studied the mathematics of vibrating strings. By the 1600s AD and 1700s AD, European scientists were deeply engaged in the study of acoustics. However, understanding the physics of a wave and actually capturing that wave were two completely different challenges. The first significant breakthrough in capturing the physical manifestation of sound did not occur until the middle of the 19th century AD. In 1857 AD, a French printer and inventor named Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville patented a device that he called the Phonautograph. Scott de Martinville was fascinated by the newly emerging science of photography, which captured images, and he wondered if a similar process could be used to capture sound. He studied the anatomy of the human ear and decided to build a mechanical replica of it. His phonautograph consisted of a large, cone-shaped horn that acted like the outer ear, funneling sound waves toward a flexible membrane made of parchment, which acted like the eardrum. Attached to this parchment membrane was a stiff, lightweight bristle often taken from the hair of a wild boar. This bristle rested lightly against a cylinder coated in lampblack, which is a fine, powdery soot created by burning oil. When someone shouted or sang into the cone, the sound waves caused the parchment to vibrate. These vibrations traveled down the bristle, which then physically traced wavy, jagged lines into the layer of soot as the cylinder was rotated by a hand crank. Scott de Martinville had successfully achieved the seemingly impossible. He had translated invisible sound waves into a visible physical medium. For the first time in history, humans could look at a piece of paper and see the physical shape of a human voice. On April 9th, 1860 AD, he recorded a 10-second clip of someone singing the French folk song Au clair de la lune. This wavy tracing in soot represents the oldest known recording of a human voice. However, there was one massive limitation to the phonautograph. Scott de Martinville had absolutely no intention of ever playing these sounds back. He conceived of his machine purely as a scientific instrument for visual analysis. He believed that future generations would learn to read the wavy lines with their eyes, much like reading a book. He did not possess the technology, nor the imagination, to reverse the process and turn those physical scratches back into audible sound. It would be nearly 20 years before someone figured out how to make those silent lines speak again. The man who would finally bridge the gap between recording sound and playing it back was Thomas Alva Edison. Born in 1847 AD in Milan, Ohio, Edison was a curious, hyperactive child who received only a few months of formal schooling before his mother decided to teach him at home. As a young man in the 1860s AD, Edison traveled across the United States working as an itinerant telegraph operator. The telegraph was the internet of the 19th century AD, a massive network of wires transmitting information across vast distances using pulses of electricity. Working day and night, Edison became intimately familiar with electromechanical devices, batteries, magnets, and the rhythmic clicking sounds of the telegraph sounder. This deep, intuitive understanding of how mechanical devices interacted with electrical impulses would form the foundation of his most famous inventions. By 1876 AD, Edison had established an industrial research laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. This was a revolutionary concept in itself, a facility dedicated entirely to the systematic process of invention, employing a team of skilled machinists, chemists, and researchers working around the clock. In the year 1877 AD, Edison was immersed in two major projects that heavily involved acoustics and telecommunications. The first project was an attempt to improve the telephone, which had just been patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876 AD. Bell's original telephone was a brilliant concept, but the transmitter, the part you spoke into, produced a very faint electrical signal. It was difficult to hear the person on the other end unless they shouted, and the signal could only travel a few miles before it degraded entirely. Edison was tasked by the Western Union Telegraph Company to invent a better transmitter to circumvent Bell's patent. Edison ultimately developed the carbon microphone, a device that used a small button of compressed carbon dust. When sound waves hit the microphone diaphragm, it compressed the carbon dust in varying degrees, which altered its electrical resistance. This created a much stronger, more reliable electrical signal that could be amplified and sent over far greater distances. This basic carbon microphone design remained the standard in telephones for nearly 100 years. The second project, occupying Edison's time in the summer of 1877 AD, was a device called a telegraph repeater. The telegraph network faced a similar problem to the early telephone. Electrical signals weakened as they traveled through hundreds of miles of copper wire. Edison wanted to design a machine that could receive an incoming telegraph message, record it temporarily, and then play it back into another telegraph line with a fresh battery, effectively relaying the message indefinitely. His design used a stylus to indent the incoming dashes and dots of Morse code onto a rotating disc of paper tape. Once the message was recorded as physical indentations on the paper, a second stylus would trace over those indentations, opening and closing an electrical circuit to transmit the message onward. To speed up the process, Edison sometimes ran the paper tape through the machine at a much higher speed than it had been recorded. It was during one of these high-speed experiments with the telegraph repeater that Edison experienced a moment of profound serendipity. As the stylus rapidly skipped over the indented dashes and dots on the rapidly moving paper tape, it caused the mechanical arm holding the stylus to vibrate rapidly. These rapid vibrations produced a distinct sound, a light, musical, rhythmic hum that Edison immediately recognized. He noted that the rapidly vibrating stylus sounded remarkably like human speech. This seemingly minor observation triggered a massive conceptual leap in Edison's mind. If a stylus tracing over physical indentations in paper could produce a sound, could the process be refined to record and reproduce the infinitely more complex vibrations of the human voice? He realized that if he could attach a stylus to a diaphragm, much like the one in Scott de Martinville's Phonautograph or his own telephone transmitter, he could use the power of the human voice to drive the stylus and carve a permanent physical record of those sound waves into a solid material. He could then use a second stylus and diaphragm to trace those same carvings, reversing the process to recreate the original sound waves. Edison quickly sketched out a rough diagram of his proposed machine on a piece of paper. Instead of fragile paper tape, he decided to use a sturdy metal cylinder as the recording medium. The machine would feature a heavy iron base, a threaded axle, and a grooved brass cylinder. A piece of tinfoil would be wrapped tightly around the cylinder to serve as the actual recording surface. He designed two separate diaphragm and stylus units, one dedicated to recording and one dedicated to playback. In November 1877 AD, Edison handed this seemingly simple sketch to John Crucy, a highly skilled Swiss watchmaker and machinist who served as his most trusted model maker at Menlo Park. Legend has it that Edison included a note on the sketch asking Crucy to build the machine and offering a wager of $2 or perhaps a box of cigars, doubting that the device would actually work on the first try. Crucy worked meticulously for several days, machining the brass, turning the iron, and assembling the heavy, industrial-looking device. On December 6, 1877 AD, Crucy brought the finished machine into Edison's laboratory and placed it on the table. The entire staff gathered around, highly skeptical of Edison's claim that this heavy piece of metal could somehow capture and reproduce human speech. Edison calmly took a sheet of tinfoil and wrapped it tightly around the brass cylinder, securing the edges. He then swung the recording reproducer into place, carefully adjusting the steel needle so that it pressed gently against the surface of the foil. He grabbed the heavy hand crank attached to the axle and began to turn it at a steady, rhythmic pace of roughly 60 revolutions per 1 minute. As the cylinder rotated and moved laterally along its threaded axle, Edison leaned in close to the recording mouthpiece and shouted a popular nursery rhyme at the top of his lungs. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. The sheer acoustic energy of Edison's loud voice caused the diaphragm to vibrate violently. These vibrations drove the attached steel stylus up and down, pressing into the soft tinfoil and leaving a continuous, microscopic, vertically undulating groove in its wake. This was a process known as vertical recording or hill and dale recording. Once he finished speaking, Edison stopped cranking. He swung the recording needle away from the cylinder, moved the entire cylinder back to its starting position, and then swung the playback needle into place. The playback needle was slightly less rigid than the recording needle, designed to ride smoothly within the indentations rather than gouging them further. A profound silence fell over the laboratory. Edison grasped the crank once again and began to turn it at the same steady speed. As the cylinder rotated, the playback needle bobbed up and down over the hills and valleys carved into the tinfoil. These mechanical movements forced the attached diaphragm to vibrate, and those vibrations pushed the surrounding air. Out of the machine came a scratchy, tinny, faintly metallic, yet entirely recognizable human voice reciting the exact words Edison had just spoken. The room erupted in absolute astonishment. Even Edison himself was momentarily stunned by the immediate and complete success of the machine. He later remarked that he was always somewhat afraid of things that worked the first time, as inventions usually required months or years of agonizing trial and error. But the phonograph, born from a brilliant conceptual leap and executed with precise mechanics, worked on its very first attempt. In that single historic moment, in December 1877 AD, humanity had permanently broken the temporal bonds of sound. The ephemeral had been made tangible. The invention of the phonograph elevated Thomas Edison to a level of international fame that was unprecedented for a scientist or inventor. He was rapidly dubbed the Wizard of Menlo Park by an enthusiastic press. Reporters flocked to his laboratory in New Jersey to witness the miracle of the talking machine. In April 1878 AD, Edison traveled to Washington, D.C., where he demonstrated the phonograph for members of Congress, the National Academy of Sciences, and even took it to the White House late at night to show it to President Rutherford B. Hayes, who was so captivated he kept Edison there until 3 in the morning. Despite the massive public adulation and the sheer scientific brilliance of the invention, the original tinfoil phonograph was a deeply flawed and entirely impractical machine for everyday use. Tinfoil was an exceptionally delicate recording medium. The act of playing a recording physically damaged the foil. The heavy steel stylus would slowly smooth out the delicate hills and valleys with each pass, meaning a recording could only be played back 3 or 4 times before the sound faded into incomprehensible static. Furthermore, it was physically impossible to remove a recorded piece of tinfoil from the cylinder and place it on another machine without irreparably bending and ruining the delicate grooves. This meant that every single recording was completely unique and fundamentally transient. There was no conceivable way to duplicate recordings or mass-produce them for a consumer market. Consequently, the tinfoil phonograph quickly devolved into a scientific novelty used primarily by traveling showmen who charged audiences a small fee to hear the miraculous talking machine perform in public halls and theaters. Faced with these severe practical limitations, and feeling immense pressure from his wealthy financial backers to produce a commercially viable incandescent electric light bulb, Edison simply walked away from the phonograph in 1878 AD. He placed the invention on a shelf, patented it, and largely ignored it for nearly a decade, viewing it as a completed scientific curiosity rather than a marketable product. However, the tantalizing promise of recorded sound did not fade for other inventors. Across the country in Washington, D.C., another legendary figure was quietly working on improving Edison's abandoned creation. Alexander Graham Bell, having secured his legacy and a massive fortune with the invention of the telephone, used his prize money from the French government to establish the Volta Laboratory. Alongside his cousin, a chemical engineer named Chichester Bell, and an eccentric, brilliant instrument maker named Charles Sumner Tainter, Bell formed a research team entirely dedicated to the advancement of acoustic technology. Between 1880 AD and 1885 AD, the Volta laboratory team systematically analyzed the flaws of Edison's tinfoil phonograph. They correctly deduced that the fundamental problem lay in the method of indenting a fragile sheet of metal. To create a permanent, durable recording, the sound waves needed to be engraved or carved into a solid substance, rather than merely pressed into a soft sheet. After extensive experimentation with various materials, including beeswax and paraffin, they eventually settled on using a hollow cardboard cylinder coated in a thick layer of a specialized wax compound. They also made a critical modification to the cutting stylus. Instead of Edison's rigid, blunt needle, they used a sharp, flexible, chisel-shaped stylus made of sapphire. This sharp stylus cleanly sliced a continuous, microscopic groove into the wax surface, removing a tiny thread of wax in the process, rather than just pushing the material around. In 1886 AD, Bell and Tainter received patents for their heavily improved machine, which they named the graphophone, a deliberate inversion of the word phonograph. The wax cylinder system was exponentially superior to tinfoil. The recordings were vastly clearer, significantly louder, and crucially, they were durable. A wax cylinder could be played dozens of times without noticeable degradation. Furthermore, the solid wax cylinders could be carefully slid off the machine's mandrel, stored safely in a padded box, and played on any other compatible graphophone. This solved the critical problem of portability and permanence. Bell and Tainter initially envisioned the graphophone exactly as Edison had envisioned his phonograph, as a serious tool for business and commerce. They marketed it as an automated dictation machine. A busy executive could dictate letters and memos into the graphophone at their convenience, and a secretary or typist could later listen to the wax cylinder and transcribe the audio onto paper. When Thomas Edison learned of the graphophone, his reaction was explosive. He possessed a fierce, proprietary pride regarding his inventions, and he viewed Bell and Tainter's work not as an improvement, but as a direct, insulting theft of his intellectual property. Stung into action by the threat of competition, Edison abruptly halted his other projects and returned to work on the phonograph in 1887 AD. He mobilized his extensive resources and his team of engineers to crush the graphophone. Edison quickly abandoned his beloved tinfoil and adopted the wax cylinder format, although he stubbornly insisted on using entirely solid wax cylinders rather than Bell's wax-coated cardboard. He refined the mechanics, improved the motor, and in 1888 AD, he triumphantly introduced what he called the perfected phonograph. Both the graphophone companies and Edison's newly formed National Phonograph Company aggressively pushed their machines into the business dictation market. However, this strategy met with significant resistance. The machines were expensive, mechanically complex, and required constant maintenance. Early electric motors were unreliable, and the alternative spring-driven motors had to be constantly wound by hand. More importantly, professional stenographers and typists actively resisted the technology, viewing the machines as a direct threat to their employment and finding the audio quality difficult to decipher accurately for legal or business documents. The business dictation market proved to be a sluggish, unprofitable venture for several years. It became increasingly clear that the true, massive potential of recorded sound lay not in the office, but in the realm of public entertainment. The pivotal shift toward entertainment occurred in 1889 AD, driven by an enterprising businessman named Louis Glass. Glass was the general manager of the Pacific Phonograph Company, based in San Francisco, California. Facing poor sales in the dictation market, Glass had a brilliantly simple idea. He took an Edison Class M electric phonograph, enclosed it in a handsome oak cabinet, and attached 4 stethoscope-like listening tubes to it. He then equipped the machine with a rudimentary coin slot mechanism. On November 23, 1889, AD, Glass installed this device in the bustling Palais Royal Saloon on Sutter Street in San Francisco. A patron could drop 1 nickel into the slot, which unlocked the mechanism, place a tube to their ear, and listen to a 2-minute cylinder recording of a popular song or a brass band. This machine was essentially the world's first jukebox. The public response was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. The machine earned over $1,000 in its first few months of operation, a staggering sum for the era. News of Louis Glass's coin-operated phonograph spread rapidly across the country. Soon, hundreds of these machines were installed in saloons, train stations, drugstores, and dedicated phonograph parlors. Working-class people who could never afford a $150 phonograph for their home were more than willing to spend a nickel to hear the miracle of recorded music. This sudden explosion in public demand created an immediate, insatiable need for pre-recorded content. Edison and the graphophone companies pivoted entirely away from business machines and began frantically producing entertainment cylinders. They established the very first primitive recording studios, usually just a large, acoustically deadened room in New York or New Jersey. The recording process in the 1890s AD was purely acoustic and entirely mechanical. There were no microphones, no electrical amplifiers, and no mixing boards. To create a recording, an artist or a small band had to stand in front of a massive, flared wooden horn. The sheer physical power of the sound waves hitting the air inside the horn was concentrated down to a tiny point, where it hit a delicate glass diaphragm attached to a cutting stylus. In order to drive the stylus deep enough into the wax, the performers had to project immense acoustic volume. Singers had to shout with operatic intensity. Brass instruments like trumpets, trombones, and tubas recorded exceptionally well because they were naturally loud and directional, which is why early cylinder catalogues are dominated by military marches and brass bands. Softer instruments like the violin, cello, or acoustic guitar were notoriously difficult to record and often sounded like faint, scratching noises. Furthermore, because there was still no viable way to mass-produce or mold copies from a single master cylinder, the recording process was incredibly grueling for the artists. If a company needed 100 copies of a popular song to sell in their parlors, they would set up 10 recording phonographs in a semicircle around the artist. The artist would sing the 2-minute song loudly and perfectly. The engineers would then carefully remove those 10 recorded cylinders, place 10 blank cylinders on the machines, and the artist would sing the exact same song again. To produce a mere 1,000 copies, a singer might have to perform the same piece over 100 times in a single day, destroying their vocal cords in the process. Despite these massive logistical hurdles, the cylinder record industry boomed throughout the 1890s AD. However, a new competitor was quietly developing a radically different technology that would ultimately render the wax cylinder completely obsolete. Emil Berliner was a brilliant, self-taught German immigrant living in Washington, D.C. He had previously invented a highly successful telephone transmitter and had been studying the problem of recorded sound. Berliner recognized that the cylinder format had fundamental mathematical and physical limitations, specifically regarding the impossibility of easy mass production. In 1887 AD, he patented a profoundly different machine that he called the gramophone. Berliner's revolutionary concept was to abandon the cylinder entirely and record sound onto a flat, circular disc. Furthermore, he changed the physical action of the recording stylus. Edison's cylinders used a vertical cut, where the stylus dug up and down into the wax, creating hills and valleys. Berliner utilized a lateral cut, where the stylus remained at a constant depth, but wiggled rapidly from side to side to trace the sound wave. The true genius of Berliner's flat disc was the manufacturing process. Unlike wax cylinders, which had to be recorded individually or physically duplicated through complex pantograph mechanisms, Berliner's discs were designed from the ground up for industrial mass production. He would create a master recording on a disc made of zinc coated in a thin layer of fat. The stylus traced the sound waves, exposing the bare zinc underneath. He then bathed the disc in acid, which etched the sound waves permanently into the zinc, while the fat protected the rest of the disc. This etched zinc master could then be electroplated to create a negative metal stamper. This single metal stamper could be placed into a massive hydraulic press to stamp out 1,000s of identical, cheap, durable copies in a matter of hours, pressing the grooves into a hard material, eventually settling on a brittle compound made of shellac. This was analogous to a printing press turning out 1,000s of copies of a book, whereas Edison's process was like monks painstakingly copying manuscripts by hand. In 1893 AD, Berliner founded the United States Gramophone Company to market his new discs and the machines to play them. This ignited a bitter, decades-long format war between Edison's cylinders and Berliner's discs. In the early years, cylinders possessed a distinct advantage in absolute audio fidelity. Edison's vertical cut method produced less surface noise, and the constant rotational speed of a cylinder meant the sound quality remained consistent from the beginning of the recording to the end. On a flat disc, the stylus travels much faster relative to the groove at the outer edge than it does near the center, causing the sound quality to degrade slightly as the record plays. Additionally, phonographs could be easily equipped with a recording attachment, allowing consumers to record their own voices or local musicians at home, a feature that the mass-produced gramophone completely lacked. However, the economic and practical advantages of the flat disc were simply too overwhelming to ignore. Shellac discs were significantly cheaper to produce, meaning they could be sold for a fraction of the cost of a fragile wax cylinder. They were also vastly easier to store. A consumer could stack dozens of discs on a shelf in a space that would only hold a few bulky cylinders. Furthermore, discs could be manufactured in larger diameters, allowing them to hold over 4 minutes of music, whereas standard cylinders were limited to just 2 minutes. The rapidly expanding commercial music industry recognized that the disc format was the key to massive global profits. By 1901 AD, Berliner's associates had formed the Victor Talking Machine Company, which aggressively marketed discs and introduced elegant, spring-motor gramophones designed to look like fine furniture rather than pieces of laboratory equipment. The relentless pressure of the disc format eventually forced Thomas Edison into a corner. Despite his stubborn insistence that cylinders were acoustically superior, the market dictated otherwise. In 1912 AD, Edison finally capitulated and introduced the Edison disc record, a massively thick, heavy disc that utilized his preferred vertical cut recording method and required a specialized stylus to play. It was a valiant effort, and the Edison discs did sound remarkably good, but it was too little, too late. The lateral cut shellac disc had become the universal dominant standard for recorded music across the entire world. Edison's company eventually ceased producing entertainment cylinders altogether in 1929 AD, marking the definitive end of the format war. The gramophone, now generically referred to as a record player or simply a phonograph, became an absolutely essential household appliance in the early 20th century AD, fundamentally altering how humanity consumed music. For the first 50 years of its existence, the recording industry relied entirely on the acoustic recording method. Artists continued to scream into large wooden horns. This severely limited the type of music that could be recorded and the emotional range of the performances. However, in 1925 AD, the science of recorded sound experienced its second massive revolution. Engineers at Bell Laboratories and Western Electric developed the electrical recording process. This system replaced the massive acoustic horn with a small, sensitive microphone, utilizing technology derived from the rapidly advancing field of commercial radio. The microphone converted the subtle pressure waves of sound into a highly sensitive electrical signal. This weak signal was then fed into a vacuum tube amplifier, heavily boosting its power, before being sent to an electromagnetic cutting head that carved the master disc. Electrical recording changed everything instantly. It vastly expanded the frequency range that could be captured, allowing the deep, booming lows of a bass drum and the shimmering highs of a cymbal to be recorded accurately for the first time. It allowed entire symphony orchestras to be recorded in their natural concert halls using strategically placed microphones rather than forcing 60 musicians to crowd around a single horn in a tiny studio. Most importantly, it fundamentally changed the art of singing. Because the microphone was so sensitive, vocalists no longer had to shout. They could sing softly, intimately, and with subtle emotional nuance. This gave rise to the crooner style of singing, popularized by artists like Bing Crosby in the 1930s AD, whose relaxed conversational vocal style would have been completely impossible to record using the old acoustic method. The advent of electrical recording cemented the phonograph as the primary medium for musical expression and cultural transmission in the 20th century AD. Following World War II, the phonograph underwent its final major physical transformations. The traditional shellac discs that had dominated the market since the 1890s AD were brittle, heavy, and spun at a rapid 78 revolutions per 1 minute, limiting their playing time to a mere 3 or 4 minutes per side. If a consumer wanted to listen to a 45-minute classical symphony, they had to buy a massive, heavy album containing 5 or 6 separate shellac discs, constantly getting up to flip them over. In 1948 AD, a team of engineers at Columbia Records, led by Peter Goldmark, introduced a revolutionary new format. They utilized a newly developed synthetic plastic called polyvinyl chloride, or simply vinyl. Vinyl was far lighter, practically unbreakable, and possessed a much smoother surface than shellac, resulting in drastically reduced surface noise and hiss. Crucially, the Columbia team developed a micro-groove cutting process that squeezed up to 300 grooves into a single inch of disc space. Combined with a slower rotational speed of 33 1/3 revolutions per 1 minute, this new 12-inch vinyl record could hold upwards of 25 minutes of high-fidelity audio on a single side. This was the birth of the LP, or long-playing record. For the first time, listeners could experience entire symphonies, Broadway cast recordings, or conceptual albums without interruption. The following year, in 1949 AD, their bitter rival RCA Victor introduced the 7-inch 45 revolutions per 1 minute single. The 45 single featured a large center hole and was designed to be played on lightning-fast automatic record changers. It held 1 song per side and became the absolute driving force behind the explosion of rock and roll music and youth culture in the 1950s AD. Teenagers bought millions of cheap 45 singles, fueling the rise of artists like Elvis Presley and the Beatles. The vinyl era also introduced stereophonic sound to the general public in 1958 AD. By utilizing a highly complex V-shaped groove and a specialized stylus that could read both lateral and vertical movements simultaneously, engineers figured out how to press two entirely separate channels of audio into a single groove. When played back through an amplifier and two separate speakers, stereo records created a massive, three-dimensional soundstage in the listener's living room, allowing them to pinpoint the exact location of instruments across the stereo field. The vinyl record remained the undisputed king of recorded audio for over 3 decades, until it was eventually challenged by the cassette tape in the 1970s AD and largely replaced by the compact disc in the 1980s AD, which digitized sound into a stream of ones and zeros. Looking back across the immense span of history, the invention of the phonograph stands as one of the most deeply consequential achievements of the human intellect. Before 1877 AD, the entire history of the world was profoundly silent. We have the brilliant words of Shakespeare, the laws of the Romans, and the mathematical proofs of the Greeks, but we have absolutely no idea what any of those historical figures actually sounded like. The phonograph gave humanity a permanent voice that could bridge the vast chasm of time. It allowed the preservation of dying languages, the documentation of ancient folk music, and the immortalization of the greatest artistic performances in history. It birthed a multi-billion-dollar global industry that shaped the culture, politics, and social movements of the entire 20th century AD. From Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville's soot-covered cylinder to Thomas Edison's tinfoil, and from Émile Berlinet's flat discs to the high-fidelity vinyl records of today, the relentless human quest to capture, preserve, and reproduce the fleeting, invisible magic of sound changed the course of human history forever.